talk about, this is chapter 17, the evolution of sociality. And what we're going to talk about today is what leads to social behavior, okay? And what are the costs and benefits of social behavior? And what we're going to look at is two examples of the most extreme examples of social behavior. And these involve individuals that often don't reproduce during their lifetime or forego reproduction and help other individuals raise their offspring, okay? And that seems like a fairly hard thing to explain, and we'll try to, and what we're developing is kind of a new model to understand how this occurs. So slime molds are kind of cool in that they're pretty simple organisms, and they're kind of composed of two cell types. One is a stalk right here, and the other at the top is a fruiting body. And the fruiting body is where they produce spores, various kinds of things that then become, new cell types. And it turns out that actually these are two cell types. The stalk, basically, in general, is a cell type that never produces any spores or offspring, or it's hard to talk about slime molds producing offspring, but in general, they have this stalk is part of the organism that doesn't produce any offspring. The fruiting body is a separate cell type where the offspring are produced. So in general, your book goes into this at the beginning, is how can selection favor one type of cell that forgoes reproduction, right? That is the stalk, and the other one does all the reproduction. And this actually gets at some issues in terms of how we eventually went from germline cells to somatic cells in our situation, where basically we have a bunch of somatic cells that never give rise to any reproductive cells, and they're germline cells that give rise to egg and sperm, and how those cells got differentiated and one forego reproduction while supporting the other is one of the things we can address. So what we're going to be spending today's lecture on talking about is what we call altruism. And eventually we're going to get to this, is that this really isn't altruistic, that this stalk foregoing reproduction and supporting this cell type to produce reproductive cells isn't what we call altruism, especially if we think about it for maximizing gene transmission. And we'll be spending a lot of time talking about what we mean by gene transmission. So this stalk is kind of helping this fruiting body, right? Even though it's not producing its own reproductive offspring, it's obviously, what do you think this stalk is doing? Huh? Yeah, it's growing, it's supporting, it's probably the route by which a lot of nutrients are given to the other cell type to produce the spores and all those sorts of things. So it's not reproducing itself, so it's foregoing reproduction, but it's helping that other cell type produce the reproductive propagules. So we're going to talk about, and what we're going to be focusing a lot on is what's called gene transmission. We're going to kind of shift the way we talk about natural selection and fitness a little bit, and we're going to try to explain this. Okay. So here are the questions we're going to look at is how does kinship, that is, how do interactions between often close relatives help us understand seemingly altruistic behaviors such as sterility and foregoing reproduction? So we're going to be talking about examples of organisms or certain kinds of organisms within species that never reproduce, are oftentimes completely sterile, and help other individuals reproduce. What we're going to be spending a lot of time on is how do those benefits of these cooperative acts along with genetic relatedness influence the evolution of these altruistic behaviors. And what we're going to use is a different concept of selection, and we're going to use the concept of kin selection to understand how worker sterility and hymenopterans. Okay, what are hymenopterans? Do you remember what those are? Huh? Huh? Yep. Bees, ants, wasps, all these sorts of things. A lot of these things have workers, right? That do a lot of the work in the colony that never reproduce, and there are other reproductives that do it. So we're going to talk about worker sterility and hymenopterans, and then an example of what's called cooperative breeding in birds, where there are individuals at the nest that aren't producing any of the eggs, but they're helping to raise the offspring, defend the nest, all these sorts of things, and we're going to try to understand these things. Okay. So let's talk about what is altruism. in all of these models, and these get into fairly sophisticated mathematical models, your book doesn't get into it too much, but we always imagine there's an actor involved. So this is sort of a two-way interaction between individuals. One is we consider the actor, and one is the recipient of an action, okay? So if an actor benefits from an action and the recipient does too, right, that's what we call mutual benefit. And that's fairly easy to understand. Both participants in a social interaction gain something from it. That's not too hard to explain, okay? It's positive. Selfishness, we see a lot of that, right? Where there's an actor that gets a benefit, it comes at some consequence to the recipient, right, in terms of, for example, reduced resources and presumably reduced fitness, all these sorts of things. This is what we call selfishness, and we all exhibit that behavior, don't we? Okay. we should try not to so much. Okay, anyway. This is the one, or I'm not really interested in spite. That's a really hard thing to explain, do you think, under natural selection, where both individuals have a negative consequence to an interaction, but it might be possible. This is the one we're kind of interested in, is where an actor does something and it reduces their fitness, but it comes at a benefit to the recipient. This is what we call altruism. So the altruism problem is pretty simple, and this was written about in the mid-60s, and a lot of models were developed. Why would natural selection favor an individual that reduces its own fitness while increasing the fitness of another? So that's kind of that's what we consider altruism in an evolutionary sense, is the case where an individual does something that reduces its fitness but increases the fitness of another. Okay? The solution was actually fairly simple. And this was the same guy that developed the evolution of sex models, all the sexual selection models, William Hamilton. He developed what's called the inclusive fitness theory. So we're going to define fitness a little differently. And this is really the best way to look at it because it has all the components of fitness. And this was then, it was later coined what's called kin selection. Okay. So this is usually, what we're trying to do is explain what seem like altruistic acts because they actually occur among closely related individuals. But so the focus is, and we're going to go through some examples of this, focus is not just on reproductive success for fitness, that is how many offspring you produce, obviously because an altruist doesn't produce any of their own offspring. So we have to come up with another explanation for how these behaviors can evolve. But instead of focusing just on reproductive success, how many offspring you produce, but how do you maximize gene transmission to future generations? So the focus is now going away from offspring to sort of gene level stuff. And this is what's called genic selection, and it's associated with kin selection. There are two components to inclusive fitness. This shouldn't be a question mark. The idea here is under Hamilton's rule, we develop what's called inclusive fitness, and it has two components. One is direct fitness, and the other is indirect fitness. And we can add these together to get the inclusive fitness. Direct fitness is kind of what we've always been talking about. So when we look at a genotype, not just necessarily survival, but its reproductive rate, and we compare it to other genotypes, what we're looking at is the reproductive success in direct fitness. So direct fitness we'll just kind of define as the number of viable offspring that are produced. Okay, number of viable offspring that are produced. Indirect fitness is a little different in the effect that an individual's behavior has on the direct fitness of close relatives. So again, kin selection involves social interactions between relatives, and it might be that individuals forego their own reproduction to help close relatives produce their own offspring. Okay? And this is what we call kin selection. I'm going to kind of go through this, and we'll be going through a couple examples of this, kind of showing you this. But here's Hamilton's rule. It's a simple equation. It's almost impossible to measure, but conceptually it's kind of a good thing to look at. Here's his rule. Altruistic behavior, and we'll talk about an example where individuals don't reproduce but help other individuals reproduce. That's what we would call an altruistic behavior. It can evolve and can be favored if B times R is greater than C. And we're going to be spending a fair amount of time looking at each one of these parameters in this inequality. So if B times R is greater than C, then a seemingly altruistic behavior can evolve and can be favored. So here are the key components. So we'll be going through a lot of examples of this, where B is the benefit to the recipient, okay? So an actor does an altruistic behavior to a recipient. What's the added benefit that that recipient gets by that altruistic act by the actor? What's the benefit to the recipient? And C is the cost to the actor. The cost to the actor is always going to be the fact that they never produce any of their own offspring. So they're actually not producing any of their own offspring, so that's what the cost is. And then R, this is really one of the key things, is the coefficient of relatedness between the actor and the recipient. That is, how many on average, and we'll show you examples. I'm not going to have you do path diagrams or anything like that to determine these. We're just going to show you this was the key. So there are two components here. One is R, what is the relatedness between the actor and the recipient, okay? And we measure that by, on average, the number of genes shared in common between them as a function of their relatedness. And the other thing is this sort of benefit to cost ratio. And so we'll be looking at, so that's Hamilton's rule, and we'll go through some examples of this. So here's your book. Had different ways. This is from the previous edition, which is a little better. So there are lots of different ways to do this, but determining the coefficient of relatedness, let's just kind of look at an example of half-siblings, for example. So if you have any half-sisters or half-brothers, this will tell you in general how many genes you share in common between them. So obviously there's a shared parent. It could be a mother, it could be a father. This is the actor and the recipient. In general, always in general, half-siblings share 1/4 of their genes in common. And the way you do it is you just take this times that to get the coefficient of relatedness. And half-siblings share 1/4 of their genes in common with each other, okay? Full siblings, and you go through these two paths, you put them together, you get 1/4, and then there's another path, you add them together, and guess what you get if you have a full sib? The R is a half. So obviously full siblings are much more closely related to one another than they are in half siblings because they share the same mother and father. Okay? Cousins, again, what you do is you just multiply all these together. Here's an actor, there's an actor parent, there's the actor's aunt and uncle, and then there's the recipient. So if you were doing something to help your cousins, right, how many genes do you share in common on average with your these are first cousins. Where do you think second cousins are? Around 16th, or it depends, but how you do it. But so cousins, in general, 1/2 times 1/2 times 1/2 gives you share 1/8 of your genes in common with your first cousins, okay? So all I really want to illustrate here is obviously who's more closely related to whom and who shares more genes in common with your full siblings, okay, compared to other more distant relatives. And as you get more and more distant from first cousins, you share fewer and fewer genes in common. If you look at unrelated, if you're an actor and your recipient is a completely unrelated individual, what's that R? Well, it's close to 0, okay? Okay? So if you had to think about it, where should most organisms, if they're going to do a seemingly altruistic act, where would you, if you weren't looking at benefits and costs and just looking at small r, where should you direct most of your seemingly altruistic behaviors towards? Your closest relatives and probably your full siblings, okay? But it all depends on the benefit and cost. But most of the things we're going to be talking about is where we look at seemingly altruistic behaviors often are, the actions are often between very closely related individuals. Okay, let's talk about some examples of this. These are what we call eusocial organisms. And this is a whole series of organisms ranging from army ant workers, okay, to honeybees, to sponge-dwelling shrimp workers, to naked mole rats, okay? So naked mole rats are in South Africa. They're a burrowing mammal that lives underground, and they're eusocial much like honeybees, army ants, and these shrimp workers. So you're probably fairly familiar with these. The characteristics of eusocial organisms, these are kind of the general characteristics that we use to describe eusocial organisms, and they, in general, have a reproductive division of labor. Only one or few individuals are reproductive in a big social colony, right? In honeybees, what do we call those? Who are the reproductives? So these are the queens, right? And then surrounding her are what? A bunch of workers, okay? So, of course, if you get rid of the queen, what usually happens is there's a massive fighting among the workers to become the queen. But anyway, most of the time, one or few individuals are reproductive, and the others are infertile. So in the case of the honeybees, the queen is the fertile one, the one that's producing the eggs. The workers are, in general, I wouldn't say sterile, they're infertile at the time. Okay, they don't produce any of their own offspring. They don't produce eggs or anything like that. Okay? This is also true. So the other thing is, so there's this reproductive division of labor in these social groups where one or few individuals are reproductive, the others are infertile and non-reproductive. Which ones are the altruists, supposedly? The workers, okay? And the queen is the reproductive. So what we're trying to explain is this worker infertility, this worker sterility, and how that can evolve. There's also cooperative rearing. Multiple individuals work together to feed and care for the young. So for example, whether it's army ant workers, they're carrying the larvae often between nests or in various locations within these large nests. Army ant workers carry larvae, take care of the offspring, they feed them, they protect them, they go out and forage for food, they do all these things, but they're not reproductive. So these are often large social groups where multiple individuals work together to feed and care for the young. Same thing happens in these naked mole rats. There's usually a single reproductive female. There are often 18 to 20 other individuals in the colony that aren't reproducing at all, and they're basically caring for the young, protecting the nest, and all these sorts of things. And members of multiple generations often live and work together in these large social colonies. Okay. So what we're trying to explain, how did this evolve? And how often did it evolve? Well, this is an example from just, I think it's just the apidae from yeah, it is the apidae. It's in the particular group of bees. And so what this represents is there are three different, I think these are subfamilies, Halictinae, the Apinae, and the Cyclopinae. All of those are the cases where eusocial behavior evolved, okay? So there were three independent origins, and there are numerous species within each one of these subfamilies. But in each of these with a mark on the end is where you find eusocial behavior in the bees, okay? All these other ones don't have it. So the question, what we're going to try to talk about is what kind of led to that. So here's another weird thing that happens in hymenopterans. They have a weird form of sex determination. It's not chromosomal. Do you know anything about this? Okay, good. So, and this has a huge effect on the relatedness, and it's completely different from the previous thing I showed you, where we have XY, XX, XY chromosomal sex determination. These things don't have it. So let's start up here. Here's a drone, right? These are the males. During the reproductive period in hymenopterans, when you see termites flying around, right? A lot of those are males and females. And some of the males are the drones, and they're the reproductive males that during the mating season. So drones, and here's a queen. Do you notice anything different about those two? How many? A queen has 2 chromosomes. A drone, which is a male, how many chromosomes do they have? 1. So queens are diploid. Guess what drones are? Haploids, okay? So they actually have what's called a haplodiploidy sex determination. If you're diploid, guess what you become? A female. If you're haploid, you become a male. It has nothing to do with XY constitution. Okay? So here's an example. So a queen obviously undergoes meiosis, right? Produces a gamete, with one chromosome. That male clones, basically pretty much clones itself and produces a haploid gamete, and they fertilize, and guess what they become? A queen or a worker. So I never told you, guess what the workers are in those huge colonies, the ones that are defending the nest, carrying the larvae, feeding the offspring. They're almost all female workers. They're, in fact, are all female workers. Okay? So it's the queen and worker are both females. What are drones? These actually have direct development of the haploid egg, and drones are the males, and they're always haploid. Okay. I'm not going to go into all the details of this, but there's a real weird consequence of this form of sex determination in hymenopterans. And that is all of these workers here, right? They're living in this colony. They're usually full sisters, right? And in our system, what's their level of relatedness? 0.5, right? Well, that's not true in hymenopterans. Turns out full sisters, and I'm not going to go into all the details, but it's the fact that a father contributes all of its genome, 100% of its genome, to these female workers. It turns out full sisters, instead of being related by half, turns out they're related by 3/4. They share 3/4 of their genes in common with one another. Okay? So this is the R here. And it turns out, guess what? When these drones are only produced during the mating season. So most of the time when social insects, honeybee colonies are developing, they're almost always females. It's only during the mating season that the queen starts producing, you know, sort of haploid eggs, and then fertilization and all these sorts of things, or no fertilization, and just the queen can start producing haploid eggs at any time that will turn into males. She does that during basically the mating season. That's the only time she produces haploid eggs. She completely controls that. Okay. So it turns out that sisters and, guess what, full sisters and brothers, guess what their level of relatedness is? In our situation, full brothers and sisters share what? Half of our genes in common? In hymenopterans, guess how much they share? 0.25. So it turns out brothers and sisters aren't very closely related to one another in hymenopterans. Okay. So let's kind of talk about the consequences of this. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but it turns out when the queen is only mated by a single male, workers are related by 0.75. And when she's multiple mated by males, it turns out to be 0.5 or less. The key thing I want to point out here is that eusociality, this is not just the bees, but these include the wasps, these include the ants, and all the other hymenopterans. The key thing here is that monandry tends to be the ancestral condition, that is where a queen is mated by a single male, but you often have eusociality as evolved. Previously I showed in bees it was 3 times. In this entire group of hymenopterans, it's evolved 9 times independently, and it occurred in common ancestors with monandry. Okay. So this form of giving up reproduction, helping presumably your close kin raise their offspring, in the case of the queen, you know, your mother, helping your mother and raising your sisters, has evolved 9 times independently in this group, but it doesn't occur in all of them. So let's kind of try to figure out, how did that happen? So here's another phylogeny, and what I've mapped onto here are what are kind of some key evolutionary things that occurred in the hymenopterans. So what's down here at the base of this tree that all of these organisms have? They have this haplodiploidy sex determination, okay? So if this were the only thing that mattered, right? If, you know, you shared 3/4 of your genes in common with your sisters and you forego reproduction, you help the queen all the time, that you know, share a lot of genes in common, what you would expect, what? Eusociality to be in all of them? But it turns out it isn't, okay? So the idea here is it's not just haplodiploidy that led to the eusociality. There needed to be something else that had to occur. Okay. Here are the other things, and I'm not going to spend too much time on them, but what happened in this group, these are all kinds of hymenopterans that feed on plants. Then you got the evolution of what are called carnivorous larvae, and these are things that, this is a whole group of insects, they're hymenopterans that parasitize other insects. There are lots of those. They actually, females go in and lay their eggs in other insects, larvae. They eat them. They're called parasitoids. This is a really common thing. So the carnivory of larvae, that is larvae eating sorts of animal products, animals or animal products, evolved very early on. Next thing that happened is larvae, actually, when this occurred, they tend to be, they're legless and relatively immobile, okay? So they're basically larvae that have no legs, they're immobile, and that sort of thing. So that was kind of important, not necessarily the key thing. The key thing that happened, and all of these things in blue are the cases where you have eusocial behavior, where individuals are workers, they don't raise their own offspring and help a relative. What happened here is, the origins of nesting behavior. So what happened in these wasps, honeybees, ants, and paper wasps and yellow jackets, so there were three kind of independent origins at this family level. What you found was nest building and immobile larvae in general make it very difficult to breed on your own, okay? So what happens is individuals tend to, it's really hard, you know, to build your own nest, take care of it, sort of defend it and do all those sorts of things, especially when you're building, you have these immobile larvae in this nest building. It turns out that's also associated with this is these things often can experience high levels of predation by things, and they have a long period of parental care. These larvae take a long time to produce, they're immobile, and they require a lot of parental care, okay? So the idea here is fairly simple. These things right here, what happened here, they originated nesting behavior, they have immobile larvae, and they're suffering high predation rates. So what should they do? The basic idea here is pretty simple. Nope, okay. So let's go. Okay. So let's take those bees, any of those ones that have these sort of large social groups in these immobile larvae, and you have workers and those sorts of things. Okay. So let's think about, let's do Hamilton's rule. Okay. So let's think about an haplodiploid. Who's the actor and who's the recipient? Who's helping who? The full sisters are helping each other, right? So the full sisters, the workers, are helping to raise their fellow full sisters. So what's R in this case? In eusocial. Yeah. Okay. So the other thing is, what's B? So the question is, what are the benefits that are being given, okay? And when we think about the easiest way to really think about that, what we're talking about is this is kind of social behavior. These are social groups. So there's a benefit to the larvae. So by being in this social group, there are a lot of individuals that are there to help the offspring, right? They feed them, they care for them. That social group, you get a lot of benefits. Feeding, basically it boils down to feeding and protection and against predators. The idea here is pretty simple. In hymenopterans, because of these sort of large social groups, this nesting behavior, and the high risk of predation, there's a huge benefit to having these social groups, okay? So the idea here is a huge bee. Okay? So we could put some numbers in there if we want to, right? Let's, we could put something in there like, oh, I don't know, you want to put 2? So then we got to know what the costs are. So the costs are, what if those individual honeybee workers, right, were to go off on their own, right? And they could do that. And they could found their own group. So remember, if you go back to that equation, the C is a cost. And what the cost, how that's measured is in terms of the loss of direct fitness. So the other thing is there's this huge benefit. Is it the benefit in terms of direct fitness or indirect fitness? The benefit here is in terms of indirect fitness. You're helping your sisters. You're helping to raise a lot of your sisters. And you're transmitting those genes that you share in common with your sister, even though you're not producing your own. So the indirect fitness component is really high here. So when you think about, imagine a honeybee worker that said, oh, I'm tired of living with my family and my group, and there are thousands of individuals who are fighting each other. I'm going to go off on my own. What do you think the likelihood is of her being successful? Not very, it's not very good, okay? So it turns out, so this cost in most eusocial organisms, this cost is extremely low. And this is a little hard to understand, but it's extremely low because your loss of direct fitness is not very high because you have a really low probability of being able to go off on your own, produce larvae that can survive and deal with predation and all these sorts of things. So it's not a very good strategy to go off on your own. That would be the case where they reverted back to, they went away from eusociality to sort of solitary breeding. In those groups that I showed you that, that have the red marks, you never see it, okay? They always retain eusocial behavior and hardly ever see a reversion back to solitary breeding where a female just raises her own offspring. So, okay. So the idea here is the cost in terms, if you have a really low probability of producing your own offspring, if you move away, there's not much of a cost. So this value tends to be really, really low in hymenopterans. Okay. So the idea here is this benefit of being, so basically the idea is it's extremely beneficial to be in a social group and forego your own reproduction. You can transmit more genes that way than you can by going off on your own and producing your own offspring and your own direct descendants. It's much better. You have much higher, inclusive fitness is much higher doing it this way. Okay? Let's go through another example that I think, and it illustrates kind of a similar idea. And this will be the topic of the other essay. Okay. So there are about 20 bird species throughout the world that are that we call cooperative breeders. And this is the best, is it the only, I think this is the only known example in North America. So scrub jays, here's a picture of scrub jays. Turns out they do, in different parts, they have this weird range. They're very common in the western United States, down into Baja, and all throughout these regions of northern and central Mexico. So this is what we call the western scrub jay, and here is the Florida scrub jay. So this is a very isolated population over here in the Florida Peninsula. So it turns out, and actually they've found cooperative breeders down in here in Mexico, but throughout the western United States, these scrub jays are solitary breeders. That is, There's a male and female on a territory, right? They produce a nest and they both raise the offspring. And that's all you find is a mother and father raising the chicks in a nest during any breeding season. These are what we call solitary breeders. In Florida, they do something very different. They're cooperative breeders. So when you go into a territory in Florida, you'll often find 3 to 5 individuals in a breeding territory. And they're territorial. Each one defends their own territory in this scrub jay habitat in central Florida. And you often find 3 to 5 individuals. You have a mother and a father, like before. Mother lays the eggs, the father mated with her and produced eggs. Then you have 2 to 3 other individuals. Guess who these 2 to 3 other individuals are? Their offspring. So brothers and sisters often kind of stick around the house, the home, for a while. And so what you have is there are a bunch of individuals, usually brothers and sisters, the sons and daughters of the breeding pair, that stick around the territory. They don't reproduce on their own, okay? They're just helping. Guess what? And what do you think they're doing? Yeah, well, this is what we'll talk about. So they kind of do this for a while, and then they basically stick around. They help feed the offspring, right? The other important thing that they do, guess what else they do? Much like the honeybee workers, they defend the nest. There are lots of predators, snake predators, all sorts of things, bird predators that like to eat these things, especially the nestlings, okay? So these cooperative breeders, these things, these brothers and sisters or sons and daughters are called helpers. They're helpers at the nest, and they stick around, and they defend the nest, and they feed the offspring. That's what we'll eventually get to that, okay? So what do you think? Should you stick around there forever? That's sort of the question. So, okay. So they do these 2 very different things in different parts of their geographic range. This is a little bit hard to see, but each one of these little black dots represents what's called scrub habitat. What do you notice about it throughout the entire range where they're found? Does it seem to be very common, or is it kind of sparse and isolated? So here's a little habitat of scrub habitat, right? Here's another bit of habitat. Here's another bit of habitat. What you find is this scrub habitat, and this occurred even before we got to Central Florida. Do you think this problem has gotten even worse? Have you ever been to Orlando? Okay. So there's been a lot of conversion of native scrub habitat to agricultural, commercial development, all those sorts of things. So this kind of habitat has become even rarer and more isolated over time. But even before we got there, it was a fairly isolated habitat. It wasn't a widespread habitat and that sort of thing. So what you have are these kind of isolated patches, okay? And the distance between them is pretty far, okay? So when you think about this, what's the best strategy for a bird that's in here? And what would you want to know? What you probably want to know is you go into that habitat, how saturated is that habitat with breeding pairs and territories? What do you think it is when you go in there? And this has been done at the biological field station. So imagine this is the amount of scrub habitat available. And each one of these represents, huh? Yeah. So, huh? Oh! There. Okay. So there's the habitat. Each one of the circles within it represents a breeding territory with helpers. Do you think it looks like this? Or do you think it looks like this? I could go on. Oh, I'll go on. Which one? Top one? Nope, the bottom one. Okay? So you go into any of these scrub habitats in Florida with scrub jays in them. That's why they're called scrub jays, because they like this native scrub habitat. Kind of has brush and not hardly any trees. It's maintained by fire, natural, how it was maintained. But it turns out these things are just saturated with breeding pairs and helpers. Okay? So what's an option when you think about it? Oh, you're a scrub jay, I just got out of a nest. What are my options? If I can become a breeder within a year, right, in the next breeding season, what do you think your options are? It's not very good. You don't have a whole lot of options. One thing you can do is these breeding pairs and some of these adult scrub jays can live 5 to 10 to 15 years. And male and female can maintain that territory for 5 to 15 years. So what are your options? What's your option? Stay at home and help mom and pop, or fly off on your own and try to start your own breeding? What do you think your options? What's going to maximize your fitness? Stay. The basic idea here is these things are just saturated with breeding pairs, right? It's best to stay at home. And usually what happens, guess what happens if a breeding territory opens up nearby? They move there. So the question is, and this is what I'll end it with, okay? What do you think would happen if a scrub jay in here decided, oh, my breeding territory is saturated, I don't have any opportunities to breed, but breeding, I want to do? What are the options? The options are to fly away, right? And find another habitat. What do you think? You think that's a good option either? What do you think if you're here, right, and you take off in any direction, what do you think your probability is of finding that habitat where you can breed? It's actually really, really low, right? The problem is these suitable habitats where they can breed are so isolated, so far apart, it's not a good strategy to disperse, move, or try to find another habitat, okay? Okay. I'm going to leave it there. There's another slide that you can look at on the PowerPoint that might help you to answer the potential essay. And then what I'll do is I'm going to basically ask you to try to use Hamilton's rule not in a real way, but tell me about the costs and benefits and degrees of relatedness in these two different habitats, and why solitary breeding is favored here and why cooperative breeding is favored there. So I'll give you the option between the Tungara frog example and this as a homework problem to turn in at the end of class, at the beginning of class next time, 5 or 10 points. And you can work together as a group. It's fine. You can discuss, but write up your, turn in each of it independently.